dollar will dramatically lose purchasing power. The more they print, the more it gets diluted. And with Bitcoin, you just can't do that. And so people who understand the concept of money supply being the driver of inflation, then they'll understand why Bitcoin is superior.
I have directed Secretary Connolly to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets.
And the reason that he decoupled gold from currency was to pay for the Vietnam War.
So President Nixon in 71, August 15th, 1971, took the dollar off the gold standard so we could print more money, so we could steal your wealth.
So a single politician with the ability to print money can turn employees against employers, can turn the customers against the vendors. They can turn every industry against every other industry. They have people rioting in the streets. And typically, the people don't realize that it's the government that's created the distress, and they blame the shopkeeper or the policeman or the person in the streets for causing their problems. And so you have unnecessary violence, you have human tragedy, businesses collapse, families collapse, people lose their lives. And it's all because the economy is, in essence, collapsing because the energy is being drained out of the currency. There are two kinds of inflation. There's inflation due to unfortunate acts of God, force majeure. So if the monetary system is being run perfectly, and if there's a tornado or a hurricane, and there's a temporary shortage of goods and services, then prices will go up. And so that is physical inflation. But there's another form of inflation, which is monetary inflation, and this is much more common. And this is generally the source of 98% of inflation in the world, the vast majority of it. And that's when all of the goods and services and assets in a society are priced in a currency that is in and of itself inflationary. So if I price things in the dollar and I double the supply of dollars, the supply of houses doesn't increase, but the supply of dollars does increase. Therefore, the prices will probably double over time.
Typically, especially if you're going through a hyperinflation, wages do not keep up. They do not keep up. And so inflation eats into purchasing power. You can't buy enough to feed your family.
The average income in this country is now $5,000 less than the average cost of living. The cost of basic human needs, food, shelter, and transportation is now $5,000 more than the average person makes, which means if you're in that category, which is most Americans, you now cannot make ends meet.
Here in the United States, they target 2% inflation. They're literally saying we want to steal about 2% of your purchasing power every year. And then we have years like this where the inflation rate is 7 or 8 or 9% higher than normal. That means they're just stealing our purchasing power even that much faster. So there's no honest unit of account for them. It's just a credit-based system. They're just making different numbers on their spreadsheets, and they say, you know what, we're going to create this much more credit this year. We're going to destroy this much more purchasing power. And it's the citizens of the country that pay for that. We're paying for our government to make irresponsible decisions. So yes, I think that's very immoral.
At this point, it's getting very difficult for people to catch up. We're seeing more people working multiple jobs just to make ends meet. We see more dual income households. There's less households where you just have one person that works and one person that stays home and runs the household and the family. Now everybody's working.
If you work for a living, you're paid a salary, you're kind of a slave. Well, that's a harsh word, it makes us uncomfortable. But it's true in the sense that you're given a certain amount of money for your time and effort. Therefore, you don't have time for creativity and innovation because you're just doing your job, just punching your ticket. Well, part of that is because your money that you're paid gets less valuable every day. We've been sold a bill of goods that inflation is good for us. That's nonsense. Why should the devaluation of my hard-earned money be good for me? That doesn't make any sense at all. Who it's good for is the people at the tippy top.
How in the world are they going to get ahead if they're operating on this system that doesn't preserve their energy and their work and their time?
The current financial system was built for the elite. It was built to ensure that those that control institutions and have a vast amount of money can make even more profit at the expense of regular citizens that are from the working class. The current financial system was designed to promote the wealth of a minority, which is why that minority tries everything possible to discourage people from using Bitcoin, because they know they will end up losing that privilege they have been carrying for centuries.
We print it digitally, so we as a central bank, we have the ability to create money digitally. We also print actual currency, and we distribute that through the Federal Reserve banks.
I like to use a silver dollar as an example. So when this dollar was created, right, it was worth $1. As a matter of fact, for a while, you could take a U.S. silver dollar note and exchange it for $1, right? So this used to be $1. Today I just checked, and it takes $38, paper dollars, Federal Reserve note dollars, to buy $1 of silver. That gives you an idea of the destruction of the purchasing power.
A person who gives themselves to honest labor and gives an honest day's work deserves a wage that will allow them to sustain their lifestyle at a basic standard. And if that's not happening, then we have a problem in terms of the way our economic structure works. And there are a lot of people who work multiple jobs in order to meet that standard. And that is probably an indication that we have a problem. It's not good stewardship to put myself in a position where I acquire so much debt that I can't sustain my living. And we have people who are doing that all the time, and we have people who in some ways promote the idea that you can live this way.
The incentives exist for the Fed to provide extremely cheap credit to banks and for them to mark it up a little bit because it's profitable for them, and then to offer that credit pretty cheaply and essentially create, debt slaves or indentured servants out of every American and anyone else around the world that they can lend to that is plugged into the Western banking system. That's just the incentives of the system that we have today.
And that's why we're seeing today in the post-lockdown world, all the central banks around the world printed tons and tons of money. And that just doesn't make any sense. And so people say, well, why are housing prices going crazy? And why are food prices going crazy? Well, it's inflation. It's actually not really inflation. Inflation is when there's excess demand for limited supply, so the price rises. This is currency devaluation.
So weights and measures were the way in which you'd say, if I got a pound of something, I'll give you a pound of this, or the equivalent. And there's a real warning in the scriptures, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, especially in the Mosaic Law, and then later in the book of Isaiah, the book of Proverbs, that talk about things like, and they use a lot of metaphors, like diluting the wine with water. I mean, how is that for an image of inflationary policy, where you inflate the amount of money in the economy because you have control of the printing presses?
Unfortunately, as governments abandon all morality with respect to preserving the value of the currency for which they exercise control and responsibility, it's increasingly impossible to count on that kind of stability. And in that light, we think in terms of whether Bitcoin is an investment vehicle or whether it is an exchange vehicle, or maybe we have to look at it as both.
There's no actual mechanical difference at all between you and I putting together a dollar printing machine and spinning up some counterfeit $100 bills and trying to go out, take those into the world and trade them for goods and services. There's no difference in you and I doing that and what the Federal Reserve does by the trillion. It is one of the core contributors to the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer.
The particularly egregious thing about fiat currency is that it can cover up theft in the name of policymaking, whereas electronic currencies based on algorithms can't do that.
I use the example of baby boomers, right? Baby boomers, when we were young, we thought $500,000 would be a perfectly good amount of money to retire on. And now, suddenly, it looks like $500,000 is nowhere near what you really should have to retire on. Well, the reason for that is the systematic destruction of the purchasing power of those dollars. So that makes all baby boomers and all citizens more dependent on government. And that's very good for government.
God's will is for us to be fruitful and to multiply. And one decision or one factor that impacts many people's decision to have children is their finances. And the state of our economy has really devastated, particularly young people's savings. And I have a ton of friends who have decided not to have children or not to have more children because they feel like they can't afford it. So I do think inflation can impact some people's decision on if they want to have children or not. And I think that's a really sad thing.
We live in a system where we are forced to use a certain currency. In our case, let's say the US dollar. We didn't choose to use the US dollar. We didn't have a vote about whether we were going to use the US dollar. We're forced to use the US dollar. And that US dollar is controlled by political organizations that make political decisions to benefit themselves at the cost of others.
My perspective is that Bitcoin does fix everything. And Bitcoin is about community.
It feels healthy. It feels like it's doing something good for society. It's something that's non-political. It is not tied to any one group or another. It's not tied to the Republicans. It's not tied to the Democrats. It's not tied to the Libertarians. It's open for everyone, and it's free for everyone. Anyone can be a part of the Bitcoin economy. It's like a good church. A good church says, anyone, come on in. Come be a part of our community. Be a part of our family. Bitcoin is that.
So we can only trust systems that cannot be discriminatory. And Bitcoin is powerful in a way that is money that does not discriminate based on race, based on gender, ethnicity, or even geographic location. A person holding Bitcoin in Togo today will have the same value as a person holding the same quantity of Bitcoin in the United States.
I'm not techie. I'm really horrible with technology. But once I understood what a blockchain was, blockchain's integrity. Bitcoin is based upon integrity. That's why I call it people's money. The government cannot make it. Bitcoin is not this centralized control of the economy. Bitcoin is built by the people, for the people.
What Bitcoin does is it gives you back that ability to be your own bank, to custody your own funds, to spend money, but the way we do with dollar bills now, but in a digital, virtual way that's really powerful.
The reason Bitcoin is better than gold is that it's more transferable than gold. You know, if you try to move $1 billion worth of gold, you need like an army to move that, and it's very expensive. If you need to move $1 billion worth of Bitcoin, you could hit a couple keys, hit send, in 10 minutes, it's transferred at the speed of light to anywhere in the world. So it's more portable than gold. It's more divisible than gold. So you could divide Bitcoin by up to 8 decimal points. So the smallest unit is called a Satoshi. So it's more divisible. If you try to divide a bar of gold or a gold coin to go pay for Starbucks, you can't do it. So more divisible, more portable, and it's more verifiable than gold. It's hard to verify gold. Bitcoin is easy to verify. You just type the key into a blockchain explorer, you could verify that you're Bitcoin.
If you look at what gold is, let's start there. Nobody carries around a gold bar, but some people just feel more comfortable holding gold than they do cash. But the reality is nobody actually owns gold, right? They don't physically own it. Some people have coins, but that's, an exception. And so gold itself is actually just a digital transaction that's stored on a ledger somewhere. It just happens to be on a fiat ledger where it's a traditional database held wherever you're buying the gold at a bank, an investment bank, whatever it may be. There are a lot of vertically integrated organizations that control your access and the distribution and your ability to use traditional gold ownership. Bitcoin is very similar in a lot of respects, only the ownership of that is stored in a wallet, which, if you have your own wallet, is stored on the Bitcoin blockchain.
For example, dollars aren't a great store of value because we have to trust that the government won't print more. With gold, no one controls the production of gold. So we know that its issuance is not controlled by any one party, and it requires work. Gold is a proof of work sort of asset where you have to dig it out of the ground. And Bitcoin has some of these same characteristics.
Bitcoin, as a store of value, it's great because you can carry it in your own wallet. You can cold carry it, which is a huge advantage. You can be anywhere in the world and there's an ability to transfer it or use it. That's a huge advantage. You can transfer it to others or buy it from others in seconds. That's a huge advantage. And you can transfer it as a method of payment in a lot of respects, and that's a huge advantage. Those advantages are legit and offer people a good reason to use it. And, if you're a speculator or you're using it purely as a store of value, it's easy to trade, store, buy, and sell.
Bitcoin might seem complicated. At the same time, I'd argue it's way less complicated, actually, if you look underneath the hood to figure out how banks settle transactions. But most of the people don't care, right? In traditional finance, you hit the button, it goes somewhere, and it just ends up in my wallet, and nobody asks how it got ultimately from point A to point B. Bitcoin is new, and I get that people have more questions ultimately about it, but over time, I feel like the trust in kind of the Bitcoin blockchain, as well as the longevity of the technology and how, the software has been up and running for so many years, people will stop asking the question. It'll become very normal.
So what is Bitcoin? Bitcoin is a piece of software that allows two parties to exchange value over the internet in a transparent and trustless fashion, as easy as sending an email. What a CBDC is central bank digital currency. Now, what it is they're trying to take, and when I say they, I mean central banks and the government, are trying to take the concept of fiat currency and digitize it into a digital dollar. Now, the challenge with this is that allowing the state to create these central bank digital currencies, it is creating a mechanism by which the government can surveil every single transaction that an individual makes. And not only can they surveil these transactions, it allows them to turn off your bank account if you start doing something that they disagree with. This is an extremely slippery slope that if we allow the government to go down this path, it has the potential to enslave humanity in the long term. And I think it's something that we need to carefully review, because if we go down a CBDC path, allowing the government this level of control, it's unprecedented, which is why we should avoid this at all costs and stick to a hard money standard like Bitcoin.
The central bank literally would be in position to cancel any transaction. It would be permissioned, not permissionless. And it's one thing, for MasterCard, for example, to know how much they paid to Walmart last year, but it's another thing for them to tell the world how much you paid at Walmart last year. And it's a whole different level of creepy for them to say exactly what did you buy at Walmart last year. And I think people kind of broadly get that sense of privacy. That's what's at stake here. I think the future of money really is one of the most important policy debates we're having today. And when you think about where people could go with a kind of an Orwellian surveillance state money system like a central bank digital currency, it really is a good versus evil. And Bitcoin in this case is on the good.
The countries that are clinging to a CBDC are trying to control their people. And those are weak governments. Weak leaders are the ones who try to control everybody. The strongest leaders are the ones who trust people and set them free.
The problem I have with CBDCs is they're Marxist. And what I mean, the central bank. Marxism is central banking system. So that's why I support Bitcoin, because Bitcoin, I saw the strength coming from the people, not the government.
I think CBDCs, wherever they are a threat to freedom. Absolutely.
You're seeing CBDCs in China right now where the populace are trying to go into a store and they're scanning a QR code and they're seeing in their wallet that it's an invalid purchase because maybe they're from a region that's 100 miles away, or they're going to a pharmacy and they don't want that person to have access to that type of drug or medical treatment. With the CBDC comes the programmability and control of the government saying you're allowed to do this or you're not allowed to do that, and we've already seen it rolled out in China and it looks a little scary. So when you're doing that compare and contrast between a CBDC and Bitcoin, it's all about who's controlling the actual ledger. One's actually decentralized, the other one is not. It's completely controlled by the government.
I think that there's a moral case to be made for Bitcoin in that it is for the end consumer, for the citizen. It is the stable form that cannot be stolen or corrupted or manipulated or inflated. And so for an individual, that is a great thing. It doesn't necessarily benefit certain governments who want the ability to wipe out with the stroke of a pen or the muzzle of a gun the bank accounts of its citizens.
So politicians promise you that they will make your houses more valuable, that you can use them as ATM and extract value from them, that you'd have cheap borrowing and cheap leased cars and cheap mobile phones, and you'll just be wasteful and keep consuming, borrowing, spending, consuming. This is not sustainable. It's not sustainable for human harmony. It's not sustainable for the planet. It leads to a joyless market society that measures GDP and exchange value over experiential value. And experiential value is much more valuable to human beings. We don't measure our literacy rates, our suicide rates, our divorce rates, our happiness, our pollution within the GDP metric. We only measure exchange value. So as long as politicians keep saying, oh, GDP is going up, therefore we're all doing great, that's a massive problem for human society, and it's not sustainable for our planet. So I think it's extremely important that we consider a sound form of money as a fundamental change for our financial and monetary system, because that'll put us back on an even keel.
So I think the most transformative aspect of Bitcoin is really almost a social economic experiment. Can all the users of a money be in control of the monetary system, right? Or do we need a handful of elected people to tell us what the monetary policy should be? If a majority of the users of Bitcoin and the people running it decide to change the monetary policy, they can.
Bitcoin solved decentralization and security. And it was the first time that decentralization and security has ever been solved.
And for anyone that's gotten into Bitcoin, reading the Bitcoin white paper is usually the inflection point where it's a 9-page, really easily understood document that lays out what's now the whole cryptocurrency ecosystem. The fundamental idea that we can have a financial system where individuals are really in control of their money. You don't have to have all of the intermediaries that were problematic in the 2008 financial collapse. When I saw that as an engineer, I thought, wow, this is one of the most empowering things that I could imagine.
The most important thing is the way it reorganizes human behavior, right? Because for basically thousands of years, most things happened in a trusted way. You had to trust somebody in order to conduct a transaction. You had to trust somebody in order to store your wealth. And now you don't. You can use Bitcoin and you don't actually have to trust anyone. You just have to trust the algorithm. You have to trust the software code. You have to trust the rules of the system. And so Bitcoin is this very transparent system based on code and based on rules. Doesn't require you to trust a bank, doesn't require you to trust the government, doesn't require you to trust your neighbor even. You can use it to do business with an enemy, you can use it to do business with a friend.
I think the fact that no one can control or manipulate Bitcoin and that everyone has to play by the same set of rules and there's no rulers, I think that makes it inherently very moral. There's no one who gets a special unfair advantage in Bitcoin, and that's different than the current system we have today, where whoever's closest to the money printer basically disproportionately benefits from it. And so I think Bitcoin can make the world a better place by making it a more fair and inclusive system, and will help fix some of the division, polarization, and the wealth concentration we see today.
The first thing that happens when you go against the government, that is a dictatorship, they will take away access to your money. And it doesn't even have to be a dictatorship.
Justin Trudeau in Canada worked to use banks to cut off money for truckers. They were protesting COVID restrictions that were put on them in Canada, and they were using the banks to do this. This was actually considered illegal in Canada, but nevertheless, Trudeau did it. Banks complied with it, and they started choking off the protest by restricting the money.
The government taking people who had committed no crime, who were not charged with a crime, who were, of course, never convicted of a crime, and punishing them for criticizing government policies, and punishing them in a way that was almost worse than imprisonment, because if you can't get at your bank account, you can't feed your children, you can't buy gasoline, you can't pay the mortgage on your house, because if the government has the capacity to starve you to death, to keep you from getting work, to keep you from shelter, then it has license essentially for any atrocity. And at that point, I began looking more seriously at Bitcoin as a currency that could be used to escape the government surveillance systems.
The U.S. government has the discretionary ability to effectively turn off the savings of whole nations at a time. That's what they did with Afghanistan, for better or for worse, after the Taliban took over. That's what they did with Russia in February of this year. Again, for better or for worse. You might say, well, these are the strategic objectives of the United States. That's fine, but what they are doing is confiscating the savings of entire nations. And it's just a fundamentally unfair dynamic, right? You are blending political objectives with people's savings, and that leads to misery, in my opinion.
Governments can, at any time, decide they don't like you or me or somebody else and sanction. If we called sanctions what they are, right, financial sanctions, starving children, you're basically cutting off supplies of goods and services to a population, we probably wouldn't like it as much. But when we call about economic sanctions, whether it's Venezuelans or Russians or anybody else, governments almost glamorize it because they're like, well, we know better. We know what's best. But censoring someone because they have different views or different lifestyle or different perspective on how the world should interact, it's not really our job.
So PayPal came out with that policy where they said, if you say anything online we don't like, misinformation, which of course, as we found out for the last 2 years, what was labeled misinformation actually came true. But if you do misinformation, they can pull $2,500 out of your account. It's not your money. Of course, they got massive amounts of backlash, and they came out and said, whoa, that was a mistake. That was a mistake. And what we're seeing in Canada, what we're seeing with PayPal, what we're seeing with the banks is that your money that you think is your money is not your money. And at any time, they can decide to censor you or block it if they want.
There's been plenty of examples of currency collapse just in the last 13 years since Bitcoin has existed. And we get these every single year. So there have been major, even middle-income nations where the currency has effectively failed, and Bitcoin has been a life raft for those people. These are places where the government has failed in some sense. And so a lot of critics think, oh, well, Bitcoin is just something that, rich Westerners like, and it's a tool to gamble with. But really, the on-the-ground adoption is happening in places where people actually need it. And I think that's an extremely telling early data point.
And so, like, if you live in Nigeria, Nigeria has among the highest Bitcoin adoption rates in the world, like more than 30% of people use it. It's actually a very useful tool to do peer-to-peer transactions.
Bitcoin, when you look at its alternative as a money where you don't have to trust anyone, and you can move it across countries, you can send it to your family. I've heard tons of stories from Argentinians on how they use Bitcoin to get around capital controls, to get around, government restricts the ability to move dollars in and out of the country, and Bitcoin is this fantastic alternative for that.
Fiat money is used to fund wars. We've spent $8 trillion on regime change wars over the past 20 years. And all those wars made America less safe and less secure and less rich. There was almost no debate about those wars beforehand. What do we get for those wars? Iraq is now worse off than we found it. We killed more Iraqis than Saddam Hussein. We killed between 670,000 and 1 million Iraqis. Iraq is now instead of a nation, it's an incoherent battle between Shia and Sunni death squads. We created ISIS in the spillover war into Syria, and we drove 2 million refugees into Europe and we destabilized every democracy in Europe. That process ended up with Brexit, with breaking up the European Union. The riots that we're now seeing in France are a direct result of that surge of immigration that was driven by our wars. So the taxpayer would never agree to fund those wars in advance. And the government doesn't want it, politicians don't want to go to the taxpayer and ask that permission. It's much easier for them to just declare the wars and then finance them by printing more money. But ultimately, the people who pay for that money are the middle class, and they pay through the mechanism of inflation.
So when the governments print money, it has the ability to fund the military-industrial complex and create tremendous reckless spending. So when you look at wars throughout history, that's a very, very profitable thing. And central banks can print money to fund both sides of the war.
As a person who was flying attack helicopters in combat, there was almost every single flight I went on, somebody that was being shot at, injured, killed. Providing that support for people on the ground was an extremely humbling experience to just see how destructive human beings can be towards each other. When you go far enough upstream as to what's driving this behavior, why is this even happening? I personally arrived that it's the money that's causing this to happen. And there's probably nothing more important for me in my life than trying to make sure people can understand that there's a better way to conduct exchange. And there's a better way to get along with each other than to have a trusted ledger that nobody can manipulate or change. Why is nobody in the U.S. concerned that we've been in these wars for as long as we have? Why isn't anybody asking about the cost of this? Just not even human life, but like the financial cost. And the reason why is because it was always paid through debasement. They didn't know they were paying for it because the bill was pushed way out into the future through the depreciation of the currency itself. And so it just didn't seem like there was a cost. And so it's not just the U.S. that pays for their armed conflicts this way. It's every fiat-based nation state that pays for their armed conflict this way. If you move to a Bitcoin standard, all of a sudden, you can't debase the cost of conflict away.
And Bitcoin, conversely, is the currency of peace. If you actually have to go to a population and ask permission to wage war, in most cases, they're not going to give you that permission.
It's interesting when the government gets into trouble and they have to pay for a war, or they have to pay for a pandemic, or they have to pay for some cataclysmic event. They tend to print money. And because you're going to have these governments printing all this money, then the money is worth less. Well, what if it were all Bitcoin? Not only would that government not have the ability to print the money for the war, you might not even have the war.
The United States government has been printing money like crazy. It's the dream solution. It's a way of stealing money without being caught. And, spending other people's money is fun. That's all there is to it. It's one of the best reasons to go into politics. You get to spend other people's money. And most voters are not aware that as prices go up, reflecting profound inflation, that this is the doings of an immoral government that is literally stealing the bread off your table.
That elite group of people makes decisions based on their own portfolios, based on their own set of priorities or those of their friends and colleagues who mean a lot to them. They're not really making up more money, they're just taking it, very often through inflationary policies, from those who have earned it. It becomes a system of great injustice and even theft. If you have centralized planning, that is, fewer people who are making the decisions about the economy as a whole, you have less information. If you have a decentralized economy, what you have are more people, more inputs, more kind of connection to the reality of what's happening than you would have if you have a small Politburo, a group of policy advisors who are making these decisions, very often influenced by their own particular interests.
If you think about Bitcoin taking over the world, right, the Bitcoinization of the world, and you play that out to its last element, what could that last stage be from a potential perspective? And that is a world in which there is no other currency. All of the governments have dropped the dollar and the yen and the euros, and all there is in the world is Bitcoin. And it is the standard kind of payments mechanism for anything. A few steps before that is going to be central banks around the world adopting Bitcoin as a reserve currency. I'd actually expect that to happen. At the same time, when I started in this space, I thought this might take out centuries. Every single year, I feel like my time frame gets shorter and shorter and shorter.
I'm excited for the future of Bitcoin because we're just really beginning to understand all of it and the uses for it and the advantages of it.
In a Bitcoin operating world, it'll just be a completely shifted dynamic. So it will be more that people can save up and then invest into a certain business. And so in a short way of putting it, it's like saying we're going to live in a more equity-based system as opposed to debt. Whereas right now, it's all about cheap debt. Cheap credit is how the thing expands. Whereas in the future, it will be more equity and savings based.
Lots of people ask, how long will it take for the world to be on a Bitcoin standard? Will there ever be a time where Bitcoin is the world reserve asset and the world reserve currency? I think that that's inevitable. I do think that's coming at some point, but I think we're still kind of a long ways away from that. And so maybe 5-10 years from now, I think lots of the world's government fiat currencies are going to dissolve, and that purchasing power is going to be transferred into either the US dollar, possibly the Chinese yuan, and certainly Bitcoin. And the world will be a more just, a more honest, and just a better place to live.
We're at a very transitional time in history. If you look back through the long lens of history, what we see is a repeating cycle of freedom, oppression, revolution, freedom, oppression, revolution, freedom, oppression, and it just goes through all of history. And I think we're at a point in history where that cycle could finally break. And I think it could break to one or the other side. And it's gonna happen in the next decade or two, and it's gonna be up to us to decide which way it breaks. And I think the cycle breaks, and either one, it breaks to where through CBDCs and social credit score system like they have in China, through indoctrination through schools and social media, they can indoctrinate us, they can censor us, they can lock us down, keep us isolated, and potentially prevent any revolution from ever happening again. The other option is that understanding that the source of all their power comes from the ability to print money. The money printer is their power. And if we can defeat the money printer, and they have no more ability to print endless amounts of money, then their entire system falls apart. And Bitcoin is that tool that allows us to beat the money printer, defeat their system, and if we move to a monetary system that nobody can control, that system never builds up again. We defeat the money printer, they never get the money printer going again, and we have a life with no revolution cycles of just pure freedom for humanity from there.